Hi. Great to see you, Senator.
Long time no see. So it's so good to see you. You're just on C. You just jumped off of you taping at CNN, right?
I was just on CNN, and I'm in Christiane Amanpour's office.
I love it. I love it. That's fantastic. Yeah, I can see the photographs. That's fantastic. That's great. Well, let me just start. I know we're in front of a lot of people right now, but I just want to personally say how cool it is to see you. It's been a while. So for folks that don't know, I've got a lot of friends who are tuning in today, but for folks who don't know, Heather and I were good friends at law school together at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, back in the day when we were quite a bit younger. And let me start by Rad has a photograph of us from a wine we took with just Jamie Craybill there, I think. Grainy photograph back when the megapixels weren't so good, but that was and then of course you and I did a with a couple other people. You were a great film director. We made that crazy zombie film for the 1Ls. I don't even need to get into that, but
it's good stuff. No,
what was it called? What was the film called?
It was called The Night of the Legal Dead.
Right.
So it was a zombie film based on set in a law school where students who were cramming had, wanted to take a super new study drug, and it turned them into zombies. And Ben played an aspiring politician.
Yes, I know. It was depressingly prescient.
But Ben, we're so proud of you. We've, since what were you, like 20, 22 when you were in law school?
A little older than that, but a few years older than that. But yeah.
Well, since you were a young adult, your commitment to public service and to the state of California has been very obvious to all of us. I shouldn't even use the word politician for what we knew that you would be. We knew you'd be a leader and a public servant. So I'm so glad that you are where you are. So thank you for your service.
Super kind of you to say that, Heather. I got to throw the pride, the sense of pride, right back at you, just to see how you were already so sharp at law school, and to bring your passion and skills to the work you've been doing, trying to help elevate our public conversation has been enormous. And I've been watching you ever since on Sunday morning shows, and then of course it's been such a fun experience for me to delve into your book. And you're also good. You did a great job on Audible too. That must have been a long and arduous process, reading the entire book on tape.
It was fun. I've discovered that I have a 4-year-old, so I do a lot of book reading. And I do enjoy it. And then as I think you guys were discussing a little bit right before I jumped on, I spent the first 6 months of the year out on the road recording a podcast. And so I've definitely learned to tolerate the sound of my own voice, although it's actually a little bit hoarse at the moment. But it has been fun to be able to really think about how different media reach people differently. There are some people who are just podcast people. There may be some in the audience right now. I frankly was not a podcast person, but there's sort of like two types of people in the world: podcast people and non-podcast people. And trying to take the ideas of the sum of us, the idea about cross-racial solidarity, and the way in which collective action can help us tackle big problems, and sort of find new stories about it for the podcast, and then think about how you hold someone's attention without words on a page, without images, was just very interesting.
Different medium. Absolutely. No,
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So this is, first of all, thank you everyone for tuning in. This is part of our book talk series that I've been doing for the past half a year or so. We've had 2 fantastic books so far, and I'm just so excited about this next one. Our first book, Heather, was The Engagement. Sasha Eisenberg, wrote this incredible authoritative account of the history of our nation's battle over marriage equality. We had a great discussion with Sasha, and then with Lisa Greer, who wrote The Philanthropy Revolution, which focused on reimagining and strengthening the future of philanthropy through greater authenticity, transparency, and trust. We're taking on all sorts of different topics. We may be going on next to presidential politics and another book on getting out of depression, not economic depression, but psychological. Yeah. So we got a lot of interesting topics. But I am so excited to be here with Heather McGhee, my good friend, who wrote The Sum of Us, which is a New York Times bestseller, also Time Magazine rated it one of the 100 most must-read books of the year last year. So why do we choose this book? Well, first of all, not only is it because I'm such a fan of Heather's, but the book is so well researched. It's engaged, really engaging reading, but it deals head on with the roots of a lot of these discriminatory policies in our country that we've been discussing, grappling with, and it offers some hope and solutions. And so I'm just excited about the opportunity to talk about this. But I also find that the book, in some respects, has been a real reminder in so many ways how we in this country, it's like one step forward, two steps back half the time. I remember, I was first elected right out of law school to the school board in 2008, the year that Barack Obama was elected to the presidency. And then to see how what seemed to be such a wonderful watershed moment for racial reconciliation and racial progress in our country, somehow also turned into a moment for a backlash, an upheaval, and a retrenchment. And then even most recently with the George Floyd summer, that seemed like such a magical moment of opening and where people were starting to talk about so many of these issues in a way that they never had before. And then to see what's happened recently with the rise in hate crimes, even just since Elon Musk took over Twitter, it's apparently like a 500% rise in the use of the N-word on Twitter, and massive increases in anti-LGBT violence. And I mean, it's just been, there's been moments of progress and yet retrenchment. I mean, what an unsettling time in American life.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it was probably in a class with you, Senator Allen, that I first learned something that really helped me always put this dynamic, right, this push-pull of progress into perspective. I'm the descendant of enslaved people on both sides of my family. I grew up in very segregated Chicago, and yet I did not know that in the wake of the Civil War, the Reconstruction US Congress passed civil rights laws to require non-discrimination, right, in public accommodations and all of that, right? And that a Supreme Court struck down those laws, thereby ushering in nearly a century of Jim Crow, right? That, to me, when I read about the civil rights cases of 1881 and 1883, if I'm not mistaken, and it's been a minute, right? But I think that was when they were. When I read about those cases and we learned about them in constitutional law, I just felt like everything I sort of have assumed by being, frankly, a child of the post-civil rights era, where it felt like progress was just happening in leaps and bounds. Every 5 years, more Americans were getting more rights. We were getting closer to freedom and opportunity in the promised land. That narrative was wrong, right? That narrative is an anomaly. That narrative allows us to be complacent, and it allows us to be easily discouraged. And ultimately, if my ancestors or your ancestors, Ben, had become discouraged, had despaired when they were faced with persecution and oppression, we wouldn't be here, right? Sure. And so who are we to despair?
That's true.
Is the way I think about it.
That's true. That's absolutely right. I'd love to get into, let's just jump right in. I mean, so let me just say a few things about the book if you haven't read it. This is a grotesque generalization, Heather, but Heather basically writes about how, as Americans, we have been indoctrinated to some extent by a zero-sum paradigm, by an idea that, if other people do well, we're going to be harmed, that we're going to lose as a result of other people's success. And of course, so much of it is based on race. So a lot of white folks have come to believe through many various forms of messaging that Black folks' success is to their detriment. And Heather says, look, we ought to move toward what's called a solidarity dividend, where we actually see how we can all benefit from policies that truly lift up all of us. There's real benefit associated with lifting up everyone, not just for communities of color and for disadvantaged folks, but actually our entire society benefits from a bigger-hearted approach. Do you think I do you a little justice there? Or
that's very good. Very good. Very good.
So what I've been thinking about, I've been really delving into this book deep, and I mean, let me start by asking you, one of the things that's been happening, I've been reading the book while I'm also campaigning for re-election. And part of the process of running for reelection involves just getting out there and talking to people from all different perspectives and places. And it's been interesting getting questions from people who come from a more conservative viewpoint while I've been reading your book.
Hmm.
You know, and
Tell me, how's it going? What are they asking? What are you saying? I want to know.
A lot of the stuff that you know, right? I mean, kind of, how is it, why the policies that you Democrats are pursuing are basically taken away from from me, from my hard-earned work, and it's also taken away from our children, and I think I've been trying my best to give good answers, but I'd love to hear your perspective. I mean, how is it that you think? What advice do you give to me to when it comes to talking to white folks who may not be inclined to read a book like yours, right? I mean, people who are reading your book are already at least a little more inclined to try to open themselves up to these kinds of
or
issues.
they've been given the book by someone they love who's more inclined, which is actually the way we're pushing the needle. But yes, absolutely. So you're right. What would I say if I were in your shoes? And give me what's the issue area where people are.
Well, let's say on taxation and investment in social policies that uplift everybody.
Right. So, I mean, this is classic, right? This is the root of it, right? It's a fundamental question of whether we are willing to share in a democracy, in a society where, we feel like people who are not of our own tribe are going to both contribute to it and benefit from it as well, right? And so that's the metaphor at the heart of the book, right? The publicly funded public swimming pools that were, reminder, that were created by everyone's tax dollars, including the Black families who were excluded from them during the generations of segregation. But that once integration came, the many towns and cities across the country, not just in the Jim Crow South, opted to drain their public pools rather than integrate them, right? So this core question of, are we willing to swim in the pool? Are we willing to share the pool of public resources with one another when we've also been taught to disdain and distrust one another? So in the book, I obviously see this idea of drained pool politics as being a huge factor in so much of the shift that happened in this country over the 20th century, from things being public goods, right? Education, retirement, affordable housing, to being private costs, where each and every family has to figure it out on their own.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, we still need all these things, right? We're still going to need to educate our children and have roads to drive on and have a public healthcare system and all of that.
It'd be nice to have pools for our kids to swim in too.
It would be very, increasingly with climate change, it'd be very nice to have kids, pools for our kids to swim in. So we need all of those things. And the question is, are we going to be sort of self-centered about it and think that if I just save all of the money that I make, I can afford it, every single one of those costs, as a private cost? Or are we going to pool our money and say, maybe we should actually pay a little bit in tax to have this available to everyone? And we actually at Demos, the think tank that I used to lead, one of our economists actually crunched the numbers, being like, okay, so what are the big sort of cost centers for the average middle class family? And if we were to have, for example, free college, right? If we were to have universal childcare, if we were to have guaranteed affordable universal healthcare, right? If that were to go from the private ledger to the public ledger, and then you had to raise taxes to account for the increase in domestic discretionary spending, would that be more or less expensive than every individual family trying to do it on their own? And what we found, we didn't actually end up releasing this paper because things changed in society and we felt like it wasn't the argument to make, but it was like, duh, obviously, like it was about, your taxes would go up by about 11% and you would save about 50% of your income. And so the fundamental question is, are we willing to recognize that we in a society have common problems that can be met with common solutions? Or are we willing to keep going forward with the illusion that we can go it on our own?
Yeah. 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 Well, let me ask you I mean, just to, it's interesting. I reflected a little. So you focus a lot on the extent to which race plays a role in people's unwillingness, including most strikingly poor folks, unwillingness to support policies that would actually benefit them. And one thing I wanted to bring up is I have read a lot of other social science that suggests that some of the worst that they're actually that I'd love to hear you reflect on this. Let's talk a little bit about the interaction between class and race, and the fact that, at least according to some social science, there is just as strong a bias amongst certain sectors of working class whites against white folks who lived in their neighborhood who are getting welfare, as there is, against Black folks who might be on welfare.
Yeah, yeah, sure. That makes sense. I mean, that's the idea, right? That's how, let's put it this way. Okay, so on pages, I think 21 to 23, at least of the hardcover, it might be the same in the paperback. I do something I've always wanted to do in writing, which is list some of the many ways in which the white middle class that we know, right, the American dream of the 20th century, was the result of free stuff, right, of handouts, of government policies that had overwhelming white support that made it free to easy for, the children of European immigrants, for people who worked in factories and farms, to gain an amount of economic security and comfort that was sort of really unprecedented in history on a mass scale. And I do that to basically say that before the civil rights movement made this country open up the beneficiaries of those public goods, that free stuff, not just to white and soon to be white, immigrants, but to everyone who had contributed to our nation's prosperity. And in fact, those who had disproportionately contributed to our nation's prosperity in terms of stolen labor. And so that moment when the pool was opened up to everyone was a moment when all things public began to be seen as not just a great, wonderful, free thing, but rather something that was suspect, right? And that when the pools were integrated across the country, people who had the means to do so started building backyard pools, right? They started joining these membership-only swim clubs. One of the strangest moments, Ben, in the book tour has been when a sort of trade magazine called, I think it was like Backyard Swim and Spa, contacted me because they were doing a racial reckoning with the history of when their industry of backyard private swimming pools really boomed, and it was in the wake of pool desegregation, right? So I say that also to say is that part of the consciousness of what it meant to succeed became being away from things that were public because they were integrated. And so that, started out with schools and pools and then became public benefits as well. And so what happened at the same time, however, of course, was that, and we can talk about the ways in which these movements, these events fed on each other, right? Is that first, civil rights expanded the beneficiaries of the public, right? And, opened the gates to let everybody swim in the pool. And then, because white Americans had been taught that there was something so wrong with people of color that they should not swim in the pool, then the pool became something that was not worth preserving, right? And then with that moment of, vulnerability around white support for government came a right-wing movement, a corporate right-wing movement that said, aha, this is where we can break the New Deal coalition, right? This is where we can say the majority of white people who've been very supportive of the idea of public goods, we can say to them, actually, that's not the way anymore, right? That will lead you down a path of having your children go to school with, Black and brown children. Trust the market instead. And so once, thank you, California, right? Once we began to see with Nixon, then with Reagan, the sort of twinning of the stories, right? Where we were saying both there's something wrong with government, government is the problem, not the solution. And that made a sort of cultural common sense to the majority of white voters, because government was now associated not with their own picket fence, but with people of color.
Yeah.
Then you began to see, of course, the agenda of those right-wing government officials was to ratchet down public benefits.
Yeah.
And then so it became, right, poor benefits for poor people, right? Then it became, instead of government enforcing high road labor standards, it became, measly welfare checks that you have to subject yourself to scrutiny by the state in order to get, right? It became, instead of public housing that was well maintained and free, public housing that, had lead pipes and, massive neglect and, a moratorium on federal investment in public housing, right? And so you began to see the ratcheting down of the quality of public things. And so then it's really hard then to disentangle what your average white person or person period, if someone if someone uses a government benefit, even if they're white, part of the animosity that you're talking about, the social scientists seeing, is because they have done something that has already been colored and degraded, right, by our racialized politics, right? So it's not like just because it's a white person collecting a disability benefit that means that has nothing to do with race, right? Back when it was only white people collecting any kind of benefits, white people didn't have the same sentiment. Just let me give you one statistic that really brings this home. In 1956 and 1960, 2/3 of white Americans supported the idea of a guaranteed job for anyone who wanted one, who couldn't find one in the private sector. So we're talking about a federal job guarantee. 2/3 of white people. Also, 2/3 of white folks supported a universal basic income, basically a sort of minimum below which no family's income should fall. That's almost 70% of white people, right? Obviously, our politics would be very different if that were the case today. 1956 and 1960. By 1964, the share of white Americans who supported those two robust economic benefits fell nearly in half to just 35% and has stayed low ever since, right? So what happened between 60 and 64, right? The civil rights movement, burst into American popular consciousness, right? 1963 is the March on Washington, which was for jobs and freedom, and actually included a federal job guarantee and a national living wage as part of the core set of demands that Black activists and their union allies brought to the mall, the National Mall. And then, of course, 1963 was Kennedy's sort of real blitz on civil rights that summer, the media blitz. And then, of course, we know, or everybody should know, that after President Johnson signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts into law, he would become the last Democrat running for president to win the majority of white voters to this day. So it's really hard to disentangle the way Americans of all stripes see public benefits since we've had this right-wing campaign to both diminish public benefits, right, and make more of a economic inequality that brings out that zero-sum thinking and that scarcity thinking, and the campaign to associate government with people of color.
I want to press on this point a little bit because you spent a lot of time during your research in Maine,
Yeah.
which has got to be probably the whitest state in the country, right, or at least one of the whitest. And it seems like your research found some interesting trends. I mean, first of all, obviously, because it's so white, the vast majority of people on welfare are in the state of Maine are white.
Yep.
And I guess you found two conflicting trends. One that was kind of feeding into the zero sum aspect of your argument, which was that, those folks who were railing against welfare programs or support programs for the disadvantaged were actually harming white people. But also you found that there was a increasing space within Maine where people were starting to feel more willing to be supportive. And I'd love to kind of tease that out a little bit, to illustrate some of the issues you were just talking about in terms of these complicated racial dynamics. I mean, some might say that there was maybe more willingness to support these kinds of programs because the state was so white. It was so homogenous, right? I mean, along the lines of the Scandinavian countries that you also write about elsewhere in the book. Others may say, and I think you point out, that there was a multiracial coalition building in cities like Lewiston and elsewhere that helped to also feed that shift in terms of support for lower, for disadvantaged people.
Yeah, so Maine is one of the whitest states in the nation. It's, goes back and forth between Vermont and Maine as the whitest. But it's, it's also a state that had the largest KKK outside of the South. It is a state that refused to expand Medicaid after the 50-state Medicaid expansion. Part of the Affordable Care Act was struck down by the Roberts Court under a states' rights legal theory, right? Most of the states virtually all the states that didn't expand Medicaid, when it was up to the states, were in the South, right? And so there's we're complex, right? I think we like to think that the dynamics we think of as part of Southern ideology are only Southern, but I really try in the book to make it clear that just as the slave economy was interrelated and national, so were the ideologies that supported it. So I went to Maine a whole bunch of times during the course of the book, and then the podcast as well, which actually tells a different but related story about Maine. And what I discovered was a few things. One, Maine had a sort of proto-Trump, right? This guy named Paul LePage, who's actually running again for governor, and we'll find out next week how he does. But he, said unbelievably racist things. He and the Republican Party under Maine really sort of, rolled out the kind of the playbook of talking about illegal immigration, and by that they really were talking about asylum seekers and refugees, really having that be the lead of their campaigning and linking it to welfare, so that you would harp on people's fears of, difference and the unknown, and a racialized group of asylum seekers who are mostly from Africa in this instance, and then link it to government and say, that's why we need to cut welfare, because welfare is being abused by these other people. And so they would, the Republicans would cut welfare, and they would cut taxes, right? They would refuse to expand Medicaid. And it was all about immigrants, even though, as you said, 90+% of the people on these benefits, were white Native Mainers. The hopeful story that I tell about Maine in the book and in the podcast is about what a town called Lewiston, which was a dying mill town, did, even though the local politician was saying, go away, immigrants and refugees, we are full, even though the state governor was like that as well, is that on the grassroots level, many, local administrators and people in the town who were white saw that new people coming into their dying, deindustrialized town where all the mills had been closed was actually a good thing.
Right.
And yes, they were very different, but ultimately what that town needed was new people.
Right.
And so they were able to create these bonds, and the influx of mostly Somali and African refugees and immigrants helped to create an economic turnaround, and then was the sort of backbone for a multiracial coalition, this wonderful grassroots organization there called Maine People's Alliance, that literally saw like a network of Somali taxi drivers using their radios to ferry elderly homebound Mainers to the polls for the first ever on the ballot initiative in the country to overturn the veto of Medicaid expansion, right? And win Medicaid expansion through popular referendum.
Yeah. And what, you know, one of the coolest things, and I don't mean to dwell too much on Maine, I'll bring you to an LA story actually in a second. But one of the coolest things that really kind of warmed my heart a little bit, or touched me in your book, was the story of the children of French speakers.
Yeah.
Who had come basically fleeing from Quebec. Mm-hmm. and you know, and they'd come to Maine for political reasons, for various reasons, or I guess I don't remember if it was political or economic reasons.
Well, both, yeah, but being, yeah, they were pursued, you know, they were, yeah, and for the jobs in the textile.
So here, this was a language minority, white folks, right, mm-hmm. who had also experienced discrimination, who had both assimilated but also remembered the discrimination and remembered the deep joy that their language, heritage, and culture had brought to them as kids, but also a very conflicting joy because, you know, for many of them, it had been like with so many language minority immigrants, the parents had said, you know, English only, we're going to assimilate. And so there was this very conflicting feeling. And to have these old, you know, white Mainers who were descendants of French immigrants to Canada who'd come down to Maine, then find new joy speaking to Congolese, African, French, you know, Francophone immigrants to their town in Maine, and learning, you know, relearning French with them, and you know, and these immigrants being teachers to them. It was such a cool story of shared humanity and shared cultural heritage.
Yeah, that's right, and a solidarity dividend. As I talk about in the book, you know, the idea of the gains that you can unlock when you put aside zero-sum thinking and racialized fears and otherization, and really, you know, there was a tangible benefit to, you know, an economic benefit to Lewiston, a cultural benefit to this woman, Cecile, and to the elderly Mainers who had really traded away their language in pursuit of assimilation, and therefore lost so much.
And they found this wonderful commonality through the language. But of course, yeah. I think one of the things you talk about is that commonality exists everywhere if we actually are willing to look for it.
That's right.
And you know, Heather talks in the book about some social science studies that involve you know, problem solving groups that get together, mm-hmm. You know, or juries. You know, yeah. People, mixed race groups are much more likely, the white folks are more likely to ask and analyze the situation with a much greater depth when there's a Black person in the room, because
crazy.
Kind of, what's that all about? I mean, that's so interesting, but it kind of forces them to get out of their own comfort level.
Yeah.
And their assumption that everyone, if they look like them, thinks like them, which of course is not the case.
That's right.
And you know, having a different colored face in the room, you know, immediately, you know, forces them to step up their level of critical thinking and analysis, and actually leads to greater results for the group, you know, as it's trying to make decisions collectively.
Exactly, and that's all, you know, of course, very relevant right now to the Supreme Court oral arguments we heard yesterday. Yes. On affirmative action, right? But just the basic idea that diverse groups are better, right? They're better for problem solving, creative thinking. They remember more facts in jury simulations. You know, it's that productive friction of being with people who look at something from a slightly different angle than we do, because they come at the world differently than we do. They've had different lived experiences. They've been treated differently. They have different assumptions, and that's the sort of special sauce. I talk about how the U.S. You know, superpower could be our great diversity if we let it be.
Yeah, which is right. The special sauce is there if we're willing to throw it into the pot and mix it around. Well, let me get back. Let's shift gears from Maine and bring it back home, for us at least, to Los Angeles, where unfortunately we have had a very serious you know, reflection of zero-sum thinking in the recent tapes that came out with those city council.
I hadn't heard about that, actually. I'm just kidding. Sorry, it is national.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was in Minneapolis and it was popping up on the news there. You know, and it's an interesting example of so now that we, you know, much of your book talks about, some of the book talks about at least the historical Black-white paradigm.
Yeah.
You know, there's much of the book that starts to get into the interesting multiracial paradigm.
Yeah.
I think part of what struck people and part of the visceral reaction to those tapes was the zero-sum thinking that went behind the redistricting process and thinking about power and representation. And I'd love to hear your reflections. I think part of what was going on there was that you had, folks who were trying to figure out a way to, there was a dynamic, well, how do we, there's a push to maintain the number of Black seats in the council, but also grow the number of Latino seats to reflect the demographic shifts that have happened in the state, in the city. How much should we be thinking about things in terms of Black seats and brown seats and white seats? There's been an interesting discussion in the city. I mean, the LA Times came out with a big piece about Tom Bradley and his multiracial model that was all about trying to find, not a Black person or a brown person or white person, but somebody who could do a better job of actually representing everybody. But is that a pipe dream? Is that how much does representation matter, in terms of color? Love to hear your thoughts on the lessons learned from those tapes.
Oof, there's so much. I mean, so first of all, it does matter, particularly in places where there's real racial animus and a history of, segregation and discrimination for communities, of common interest, of common, history, experience, who are treated and targeted the same way, who live in a place because they were targeted in that way, to be able to elect a candidate of their choice, right? So it's a little bit slippery to want to say, well, we should be colorblind and there should be no such thing as a Black seat or a brown seat, when in many parts of the country, right-wingers on the court would love to take that logic and say, well, then it's okay that there's only, 1 or 2 representatives in Alabama who are Black, right? That type of system of racial gerrymandering has been, the process for all of Alabama's history, right? To break up Black communities, to make sure that they are underrepresented in the halls of power. And so that's the context for even thinking about race and redistricting in this country. That said, you would hope that in California, there would be a sense that, and this is really like the big question, right? California is already a majority people of color state. And so does that mean that there has been enough community cross-cultural solidarity where if there is a Black person in the seat, the Latino community leaders feel like absolutely that person will have our backs when there's an issue of great importance, right? Like, because what are we talking about? We're talking about the representation to be able to vote in a certain way to help the community, right? To address the harms and the threats and the problems that a community faces. And so if you sort of step back from the kind of nastiness and the ugliness of the conversation, the core question is, are we talking about raw power and representation, or are we talking about the results, the outcomes of what the city council is actually able to do for communities? And is the fear that those Latino leaders had of not having more power actually based in just a sense that they needed more power, or in a sense that their community would not be well represented if they didn't have more power? Now, then you add on to it, right, the anti-Indigenous, like anti-Brown rhetoric in the same conversation, and you see that actually, it's not actually about across Latino solidarity, right? And it's, because they essentially, and I'm not trying, I don't know these people well enough. I'm not a Californian, at least not anymore. I don't live in LA, but I don't want to sort of, say that I know everything that's in their hearts, but I will say that there is a long history in this country of people who are assimilating into white supremacist views and ideologies in order, as they gain power and as they gain privilege and as they gain, success. That is, so to be like anti-Black and anti-Indigenous in sort of one conversation is about as white American as you can get. And I do think that, ultimately, there have been so many beautiful stories of Black-Brown coalitions that have done tremendous work in Los Angeles and all over the state of California. And it's to them that we need to be looking right now for the healing that's necessary, and for the models, like California Calls, for example, comes to mind, for the models of how we can be greater than the sum of our parts. And we don't have to divide, but rather we can add up, and people can say, as the labor movement has traditionally, like the best, most progressive parts of it has said, no one fights alone, right? If
Yeah.
your neighborhood is dealing with something, we're gonna have your back.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, I mean, the great irony is there's, to some extent, the battle going on was actually, an internal battle. Part of why the tape was released, it seems to have been part of an internal battle within the labor movement. So, so, and actually, let's build upon this. I mean, there was a line in your book where you referred to, it really struck me, recovering with grace from missteps.
Yeah.
So, building out, and we don't have to use the LA City Council example as an absolute paradigm, but right now there's a whole debate over Kevin De Leon. Does he resign? Does he stay? Seems like most voices are calling him to resign. He's sticking it out. Talk to me a little bit more about what you meant behind that line, recovering with grace from missteps. To what extent do we, how do we provide space for people to recover from their missteps, and to what extent do we not? I mean, to what extent are some actions too egregious to forgive?
I mean, I think, in that instance, again, I don't know these figures as well as I'm sure many of the people on the call do. But
it doesn't have to be just about this particular incident, but
yeah. But what do I mean?
Culture, I don't know.
You've got to be able to recover with grace from missteps, right? We all live in a society that has inundated us with stereotypes about women, about people based on their ability, about age, about body size, about race, about ethnicity, about language, right? That has been the air that we have breathed. And so there is no way that we have not all, to some extent, no matter what our identity is, absorbed some of those negative beliefs and associations, right? Whether they're unconscious or just conscious, right? And so a world in which we, each as individuals, has not exercised the muscle of making a mistake, of offending someone, of speaking about something out of ignorance, is a world in which it's hard to do coalition building, right? That's just plain and simple, right? There's going to be a moment when you didn't know something, you probably should have, you said the wrong thing, you did the wrong thing, you believe the stories you've been told, and you're still awaking, right? And so I don't want to put the onus so much on like, how can we, maybe the offended community make space for the apology and the recovery. I think really what often happens is the people who make the mistake don't have, don't have the grace and the kind of emotional mastery to be able to own up to their mistake. Be very thoughtful and not try to say, but I'm not a bad person, and like all the things we do to deflect, and just say, actually, I was wrong. I have been, called out on how I was wrong, and I agree that I was wrong, and I will never do it again. And offer something that is in a way to like really demonstrate through your actions that you really are in solidarity with that community, and that you really are willing to do better and to change and to do something that, maybe takes a little bit of a sacrifice, that isn't just PR, to be willing to move forward, in arm in arm with whoever it is that you've offended. I think it's really important. It's hard, but frankly, like anybody who's been married, has experienced what it is to truly apologize, and to truly recover and to make amends. And I think, as I say at the end of the book, we as a country, this country born in genocide and kidnapping and mass theft of labor and torture and rape, need to atone. And, I do, before we end this conversation, want to talk about Manhattan Beach, actually. We need to atone. And in some ways, part of the awkwardness that we all have is because our country hasn't sort of led in the way, right? Our governments have not shown us how you atone. But, the second to last episode of the podcast of The Sum of Us, it takes place in Manhattan Beach, and I go surfing, and I go to that fancy oceanfront community where 100 years ago there was a thriving Black beach resort called Bruce's Beach, and where white folks in the town said, we don't want this anymore. We don't want all these Black people coming here. We don't want these Black people being landowners or being successful here. So we're going to vote in the city council to use eminent domain to just condemn this area and turn it into a park. And then they didn't turn it into a park for another generation or two, right? And that, there was a debate over the past handful of years that really crescendoed in 2020 about what should Manhattan Beach do about this history that they tried to suppress, and what should they do with this land, which was effectively, malevolently stolen from this community. And that changed the course of history of who feels like they belong in Manhattan Beach, who surfs in Southern California, right? And so when I was talking to people in Manhattan Beach and talking to the city council members, and then the county supervisors who ultimately were able to make the change to have reparations and to give the title to the land back to the family, what really occurred to me is that it isn't a zero sum. It wasn't like, so a lot of the people in Manhattan Beach, a lot of white folks in Manhattan Beach were opposed to an apology, right? Defeated the task force that recommended an apology, because they were saying, well, it's not our responsibility. Why should we Manhattan Beach, right? First of all, they're saying like they are the city, which is interesting, right? Apologize for something that, happened a long time ago. We didn't do that. And it was like, first of all, there's an opportunity for you to be the ones to make things right? Why wouldn't you take that opportunity to not say we did this, but in fact, what we are doing is making it right? And there's a benefit that we all receive when we can rest assured that if a government wrongs us, they will make it right. And that they won't just say, 10, 20 years from now, well, that wasn't us who did it, right? It's a new legislature. And so there's never any recompense, right? The atoning is important for everyone.
Yeah. Where do you see, where do you, yeah. I mean, and I'm very involved with that whole case, and I really appreciate the way you framed it. One of the challenges I think moving forward is that, at least in that case, it was, land that was still under public control. And there's been a lot of land seizures and eminent domains where the land ends up in private control. And I think that's going to be a really tricky next step of the whole reparations conversation, especially agricultural land in the Central Valley. And I don't know if you have any interesting insights for me about how we're going to address that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I mean, I think that ultimately there, in some ways, the legal piece of it is work that needs to be done. But there's also, and I thought, sort of naively going into it, that the residents of Manhattan Beach were really behind this, right? I thought this was going to be a success story about people on the ground in Manhattan Beach wanting to do the right thing. And when I learned more and talked to more people there on the ground, I realized that actually, the important work that needs to be done is work that is really about the truth and racial healing piece, so that white residents in a community don't see reparations as a zero sum, and that there can be real truth telling and real healing and real understanding of the rights and responsibilities that we all have in a society. And in some ways, and the Bruce's family members, said this, like they would rather have that, right? They would rather have Manhattan Beach be a place where the community really embraced Black people coming to swim, where the community really embraced the idea that of course we should have an apology, than the financial piece of it, right? And so I think that's the piece that we really need to focus on. I should say that right now, just last week, we launched an action guide to accompany the podcast. So people who've read the book, who are interested in the podcast, who are interested in the themes, or interested in taking action, please take a look. It's on thesumofuspodcast.com, just 3 W's, www.thesumofuspodcast.com. And it's really a take action guide for people to take the little courageous steps that so many of the heroes in the book and in the podcast have done, and find out where they can get involved.
Heather, thank you so much. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for writing this book. I mean, honestly, it's a tough but important book to read. It grapples with some really fundamental ugliness associated with with not just our history, but how the history lives today. I mean, one of the things you talk about so much is how these earlier decisions are, playing out. When you talk about generational wealth and how that continues to impact communities, and yet people think that the status quo is just, imposed by God. I mean, it was actually to a large extent imposed by previous public policy. It's sometimes hard to feel optimistic, but as you say, we don't have the luxury to despair, when we think of our ancestors and what they went through. Right. So, in this wild moment in American life, leave us with some, with a parting word of hope. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your friendship, but also for your leadership on leading these incredibly important discussions in our country.
Well, the reason why I made the podcast, to be very honest with you, is that I myself needed some hope, that I finished writing the book in November in 2020, right? So you can think about it, the editor wrestled it from my hands right after the election was called for President Biden. And I felt like we were in a moment when we could overcome the politics of divide and conquer. And then, of course, January 6th happened, and the backlash against racial justice, and the, book bans all over the country, and the right-wing takeover of the court, and all of this. And it just really made me feel as though I needed to remind myself that this country still has promise, and that every day ordinary people are doing extraordinary things. And so if people want some reason to hope, I really do want to point you towards the show. It's available free wherever you get your podcasts, and it's 8 new stories of hope that are not in the book, and including, one from California, your very own Manhattan Beach. And it's really, and there's a young readers version of the book coming out in February for those of you who have middle grade students and or are educators. And I am a hopeful person, because I know that decisions made the world that we have today, and better decisions can make a better world. So I also want to thank you, Ben, because it is not easy to be a public servant and to be in charge of making public policy decisions. It's not easy to run for office, and I really appreciate you for putting your hat in the ring and doing so, and for spending your time as a state senator to convene conversations like this.
Well, you're the best, Heather. Thank you. Everybody, please go vote. Make sure to vote, but read this book and grapple with these issues, and listen to Heather's podcast. She's a wise and important voice in our society, in our country, and I'm just proud to call you a friend. So thank you. So good to see you. All right.